Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a review of the Anbernic RG406H. Now if this handheld looks familiar, there's a good reason for it, and that's because it's basically just another iteration of the same model they've been making for the past year or so. This is the fourth time we've seen this exact same chip in Anbernic handhelds just this year. And just a couple months ago I made a review video about this handheld, which is the RG406V. Now the big thing about this one is that it had a new 720p 4-inch screen, as well as updated analog sticks finally. And the RG406H that we're reviewing here today is essentially the horizontal version of that handheld. This one has that updated screen as well as analog sticks, while still keeping a very similar shape and size to other handhelds they've released. And this is a very familiar path with Anbernic. They make these small improvements with each handheld they release, and they release one about once a month. And much like with other handhelds they've released this year, the RG406H is probably the best they've ever made. And we're definitely getting to this strange situation where yes, every handheld that Anbernic releases is better than the one before. And so logically they should be easy to recommend, but the fast output of all their handhelds also gives me a little pause. Because when it comes down to it, the RG406H is probably my favorite mid-tier handheld from Anbernic. And so yes, I think you'll have a great time if you happen to pick one of these up. But because they keep making them better and better, it also leads me to question whether or not you should just wait a month or two and see what they come up with next. Anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's do a deep dive review of the RG406H and see whether or not it's worth your $180. Okay, let's get started with the specs. The CPU here is going to be the Unisoc T820. And like I mentioned before, this is the fourth handheld that we've seen from Anbernic this year that uses the same chip. It's got 8 cores and a Mali GPU and can perform pretty well all the way up to GameCube and PS2. We've also got 8 GB of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage, plus a microSD card slot for more. Now the display is relatively new. We've only seen it in one other handheld. It's 4 inches, 4:3 aspect ratio with a resolution of 960 by 720. This makes it one of the largest 4:3 displays that have a higher resolution, and I think it looks great. The battery is 5,000 milliamp hours, and I found over the past couple days of testing to get between 6 to 8 hours of battery life depending on what you're playing. And in terms of weight, it's 265 grams, which is a little over 9 ounces. I think that's pretty average for a handheld this size. In terms of connectivity, we've got 5 GHz Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 5.0, and this is an Android-based handheld. It's running Android 13. And then finally, it's got some other features we've seen in other Anbernic devices with this chipset, including video out and then Hall sensor sticks and triggers. Now, as of making this review, the device itself is not for sale yet, but it should be up in the next week or so. And in terms of pricing, they told me it's going to be $168 retail plus shipping. Shipping is usually about $10 to $12. So it's really about a $180 handheld. And then also bear in mind they're going to drop down the price about $10 in the first few days of sale, and then usually a couple months after it first released, they will knock the price down again. You'll see a bunch of sales on like AliExpress. So just to be conservative here, I'm going to call it something like a $175 handheld. And we've got 3 different color options. We've got white, black, as well as transparent purple. And I've got the white and purple ones here in the studio to do some comparisons with. So let's jump into the unboxing, and like with all my reviews, all opinions are my own, no money was exchanged in any way, and they're not going to see this video ahead of time. Inside the box we're going to get very standard Anbernic stuff, so it's going to have a screen protector as well as a quick user guide. And then also it's going to come with a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. So let's go ahead and take a look at the device itself. I'm going to unbox the white one, and man, I think this one looks really clean. They've actually released quite a few all-white handhelds like this, and I really like this look. It's probably one of the better designs they've come up with this year. And so I definitely like these overall clean aesthetics. Now, if you've been following Anbernic pretty closely, then this is going to look really familiar. It's basically just a slightly wider version of the RG Cube. It's got those nice ergonomic grips which make it very comfortable. Now, first impression when holding the device is that we have these new analog sticks and they are quite prominent. And when you combine the protruding sticks and the ergonomic grips, we get something that's pretty darn thick altogether. In fact, if we measure it at the thickest point, it's about 37.5 millimeters. To give you an idea of how thick that is, let's use another device with similar sticks. This is the Retroid Pocket Mini. Now the sticks on the Retroid products are more inset into the body. And as a result, you can see there's about a 10 millimeter difference between the two, even though the Retroid Pocket Mini does have ergonomic grips. Now let's compare that against another older handheld from Anbernic. This is the RG405M. This one came out nearly 2 years ago, and so it's got an older chipset in it, but it does have a 4-inch screen with a lower resolution. And this one does not have ergonomic bumps, and the sticks are also inset. And you can see here that it's actually about half the thickness of the RG406H. And so yes, my first impression here is that this is quite a bit thicker and bulkier than I was expecting. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that these analog sticks do protrude from the case quite a bit. And I'm a little torn about this. We'll talk about it when it comes to actual gameplay because I do think it is a good thing. But if you are someone who wants to easily slide it into your pants pocket, it may become a big deal. In fact, when doing some pocketability testing like I usually do with these handhelds, I actually had one of the analog sticks pop right off. And this is something that rarely happens with these handhelds, and so if it easily happened while doing my testing, I do think this might be an issue if you try to do the same. And so to put it another way, I think that overall the size of this handheld is still pretty compact and portable. But this overall thickness, the combination of the sticks and the grips, is just a little bit too much to easily slide into my pocket. But the big trade-off is that it is a very comfortable handheld. It has the same style of ergonomic grip as the RG Cube, which means that it has a little bit of a gritty texture here in the center, and I really like that. And because it is relatively small, it's very easy to reach all of the buttons. It's just a very comfortable handheld altogether. I also like the overall impressive size of the screen compared to the rest of the body. And to give you an idea of just how big this is, let's jump right into a size comparison next. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, this is basically the horizontal version of the RG406V. And so it has the same screen and analog sticks. It's very similar, just a different form factor. And so what I want to do with my size comparisons is keep it to horizontal handhelds instead. Let's start with the RG Cube because I think that the RG406H is just an elongated version of that handheld. The major difference here is going to be the screen, which is 4 inches but a square aspect ratio on the RG Cube. This means the 406H above is going to be a little bit wider, but also not quite as tall. But I think in all other respects, yes, these are very similar handhelds. After all, they have the exact same chipset as well. Another handheld with the same T820 chip is going to be the RG556. Now this one's a little bit different. It has a 5.5-inch screen that is AMOLED and also with a 16:9 aspect ratio. I would say between the two, the RG556 is a lot more comfortable to hold because it has larger grips. But the thing that's always held me back about the RG556 are the analog sticks. It's using the older versions, and I'd love to see a new version of the sticks in a newer version of this handheld. Moving on to other 4-inch screens, let's go back to the RG405M. Like I mentioned, this one's using an older chipset, so it's not going to have quite the same performance, but you can see that this one is quite a bit smaller. After all, it doesn't have any ergonomic bumps, and it's just a lot more compact. Another smaller 4-inch handheld is going to be the RG40XX-H. This one is among their budget line, so it only cost about $60 or $70, and this one is also using a lower resolution screen. It's only 480p. And between the two, I think that the 406H is just a much more premium feeling handheld. One big difference between the two is going to be the plastic texture. So on the 406H, it's a little bit grittier and just feels more professional. On the 40XXH, it's a little more slick and cheap feeling. Okay, let's compare a couple other 4:3 aspect ratio Android-based handhelds. We'll start with the Retroid Pocket 2S. This one has a 3.5-inch screen, which I've always felt to be a little bit on the small side. Instead, the 4-inch screen on the 406H is just right. And here's a comparison with a more recent model from Retroid, the Retroid Pocket Mini. This one has a 3.7-inch AMOLED display that's also 960p, so it's a higher resolution and of better quality. However, even this 3.7-inch screen is noticeably smaller than the 4-inch one. And while I think it's no contest that the AMOLED display is better on the Retroid Pocket Mini, I find myself enjoying the 406H screen more. It's only a 0.3-inch difference, but it's enough to make it a little bit better of an experience for me. Now, thankfully, if you are looking for a bigger screen, we've got other options, but most of them are going to be 16:9. We'll start with the Retroid Pocket 5, which has a 5.5-inch AMOLED display with a 1080p resolution. And we'll talk more about these two devices near the end of the video, but I did want to say that something that's very similar between the two is just the screen to body ratio. The Retroid Pocket 5 is probably a little bit more impressive in that regard, but still the 406H kind of can hold its own. It is a very impressive screen for the size of the handheld that you're getting, and I always love that ratio. And honestly, the Retroid Pocket 5 and the 406H are kind of in the same price bracket. There's about a $50 difference between the two, but they're still what I would consider to be mid-tier. Now, a high-end Android device would be this one here, the AYN Odin 2. This one's got a much more powerful processor and a larger display. This one is 6 inches, but 16:9. But as you can see, the 406H, even though it has an impressively large screen, is still quite a bit smaller than the Odin 2. And then finally, because I always love to show this off, here's a comparison with the Steam Deck. And you can see that the 406H is about the same size as the screen on the Steam Deck, which is pretty silly. And so really when it comes down to it, the RG406H is somewhere between the Retroid Pocket Mini and the Retroid Pocket 5. So if you've been eyeballing the Retroid Pocket Mini, but you think that the screen might just be a little bit too small, you can see that the difference between the two is not that much. And then of course, if you're looking for something just a little bit bigger than the 406H, then the Retroid Pocket 5 might come in clutch. So in other words, the RG406H is a pretty good average size. It's a comfortable handheld that is nice and compact, but not quite to the point of being easily pocketable. Okay, let's move on to talk about these controls. I'm going to be a little bit brief here just because it's kind of the same song and dance when it comes to Anbernic with one exception. And of course, this is going to be those new analog sticks. This is the first time we've seen it in a horizontal handheld from Anbernic. These are Hall sensor sticks but have a huge range of motion. And so even though they are a bit on the small side, I've always preferred these over the Nintendo Switch style ones that you usually will find. If we compare it to an older device like the RG Cube, this one has that previous model of sticks, and you can see that, yeah, they basically have no travel whatsoever. And so I am very glad to see these new sticks on the 406H because I think it's a big improvement. Now let's take a closer look at what I was talking about earlier, and that these sticks really do protrude a lot. You can see that the housing is basically flush with the rest of the case, so it's not inset at all. If we look at the Retroid Pocket 5, which has the same sticks, it's quite a bit more inset. And this is what makes the Retroid Pocket 5 a lot thinner by comparison. And whether or not you see this as being a good or a bad thing is really going to come down to what you value the most in a smaller handheld. If pocketability is a really big deal for you, then the RG406H might be a bit of a disappointment. However, if you're the type of person who prefers more analog stick control when playing a game, then having sticks protrude like this is actually a good thing. So let's do a quick test of these sticks. We'll start with just the overall inputs themselves, and here I'm just verifying that, yeah, we're not having any sort of cardinal snapping, everything works really well. And so we are getting a full range of true analog motion. Now the biggest thing that I enjoyed about testing these sticks is the fact that those elevated sticks give you just a lot more control. And it really comes into play when you're playing something that's a dual stick game, for example when doing game streaming. When it comes to a handheld this size, in general, I just don't enjoy streaming on them. And most of that has to do with the fact that it just doesn't compare to a full-size controller. However, the height of the stick in combination with those ergonomic grips actually make it a pretty enjoyable experience. In fact, this might be the first 4x3 handheld that I've ever used that I actually would play something like Doom Eternal on. There are some other concessions to make, for example the fact that we're shrinking down a 16:9 display on a 4x3 screen, but all things considered, this is probably one of the best experiences I've had on a handheld this size. I think the perfect fit might be a 4x3 FPS game, something like Time Splitters 2 on the GameCube. Playing this game at a 2x resolution on a 4-inch display with a higher resolution, plus those analog sticks and analog triggers, is just kind of a dream come true. In fact, this is probably the best experience I've had with Time Splitters 2, which is an awesome game. And because we got that full range of analog controls, even single analog stick games, things like Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, these are also a dream to play. So in the end, yes, these sticks do protrude from the case quite a bit, but I am willing to take that concession because of the improved gameplay experience. Okay, let's move on to the D-pad. This again is very familiar if you've been following Anbernic. This is one of those floating shield style D-pads that you find on something like a Sega Genesis or a Sega Saturn controller. It does have a rubber membrane feel to it, but it's a little bit more modern as well. The rubber padding below it is quite stiff and tactile and gives you a bit of a nice forced feedback. It also has a good amount of pivot to it, and so I think this is a very responsive D-pad altogether. Now I always like to test certain games when trying out a D-pad. We'll start with Contra. So here I like to press down and then move it left and right and see how much the character moves. And if I just barely move it left and right, then the character will stand still, but if I try to push it all the way to one side or the other, yes, I can make the character walk. And I think this is a pretty good middle ground when it comes to this style of D-pad, which is meant to roll off your finger. And so even though diagonals are pretty easy to hit when playing this game, it's still one of those things where you know you're going to hit it because it'll roll the entire D-pad over. So long story short, when playing a game like Contra, I feel like I have enough control over the character to be able to play this game well. Another good example would be what I call a precision platformer like Celeste. In this game, it's really important to make sure you hit the diagonal when you want to, and then to not when you don't. And I would say here the controls are pretty good. Now I do have to stretch my thumb down just a little bit to reach the D-pad because this is an analog-centric device. But I think the D-pad is positioned well enough that I didn't find this to be uncomfortable no matter what input style I used. Now finally, let's try out a fighting game like Street Fighter III Third Strike. Now, as I mentioned previously, I grew up playing with a Super Nintendo controller when learning how to play games like this, and so a D-pad like this is a little bit awkward for me. But even then, after a few rounds of testing, I was finally getting the hang of it. And so I think that if you are wanting to play fighting games on this device, and you don't mind playing a Shield-style D-pad, this might be a great fit. And so much like with the other Anbernic devices that had the same style D-pad, I do enjoy this experience. Now for the face buttons, it's also a very familiar feel. These are glossy rubber membrane buttons, which means they have a more retro or classic feel to them when you press down. And the membranes that they're using here are also relatively stiff, and so they have a lot of bounce to these buttons. It does take a little bit more force to actually press down on the button, but I love the tactile feedback when it bounces back up. So in general, I don't really have any complaints about these face buttons. In terms of other buttons, we have our start and select buttons on the right, and then on the left we have two different Android buttons. The far left button will bring up the RG launcher, which is the Anbernic front end, and then the inside button functions as a back button if you tap on it, and then a home button if you hold it for a couple seconds. Now looking up top, we've got a power button, our volume up and down, and then an LED indicator that'll turn red when you charge it. To the right of that, we've got our exhaust vent, because this does have an active cooling fan. If you look at the back here, we've got two intake vents, so the air will go in through the back and then out through the top. And then finally up top we have our shoulder and trigger buttons. And both these buttons have a slightly bumpy texture to them. I really like this. It's kind of hard to see on the white model, but easy to pick up with these black buttons here, and so I do like this overall design. Now the triggers themselves have an analog input, and I think they feel very good. They don't have a super wide travel to them, but you still have the ability to hit it at any of these points as you move the button down. So for example, when playing a driving game like Forza Horizon 5 over streaming, I can use this full input. So if you are looking to play games that have more nuanced trigger controls, I think that the RG406H is going to be a good fit. Now, in addition to the triggers, we have the shoulder buttons. Let's do a quick audio test of these because they are a little bit clicky. Now, one interesting thing is that the shoulder buttons on the purple model are a little bit quieter, not by much, maybe 10%. Let's do a quick audio test of these too. Now, it's a very subtle difference, and I'm not sure if the audio is going to pick it up, but there is a slight difference between the two. Neither of them are what I would consider to be loud, but one is louder than the other. Now looking at the bottom, we've got two down-firing stereo speakers. Let's do a quick audio test with Streets of Rage 2 at full volume. So first and foremost, these are very loud speakers. In fact, I probably would not push this beyond 50% volume. It's that loud. And even though they are down-firing, I think the audio quality here is relatively good. Much like with most of the other retro handhelds, it's going to lack a little bit of bass, but overall I think the audio is clear. Now also on the bottom, we've got our micro SD card slot as well as a headphone jack, and then finally our USB-C port. This can be used for charging, but then also video out. Now the way this works is very similar to the other devices that have used the same chipset. You're going to need a USB-C to HDMI adapter like I'm using here, or a USB-C hub. One thing of note, this will not charge the device at the same time it's giving video out, so you'll have to pick one or the other. And as you can see, when you plug it in, by default, it's just going to mirror the screen. So it's going to show up as a 4:3 image on your 16:9 TV or monitor. Now when playing 4:3 content, that's going to be perfect. So if you plan on using this as like a retro gaming machine, playing things that originally ran in 4:3, then this is just going to work naturally. And you've got a couple different options when it comes to consoleizing your device. You could either just play directly on the controls on the handheld, or you could connect it with a Bluetooth controller. I tested both and didn't find any noticeable lag when it came to the Bluetooth controller as well. Now the big rub when it comes to this default setup is that when playing 16:9 content, it's going to force it into 4:3. So for example, when playing PSP, that means we're going to have black bars on the left and right, and because we're squishing down a 16:9 image, we're going to have black bars in the top and bottom as well. And so this is not an ideal way to play something like PSP or a native Android game. Now thankfully there is a way to change that. When you plug it into an external display, you'll find in the top-down menu an option that says wired projection. If you open that up, you can choose between the handheld game console mode, which is on by default, or desktop mode. And if you want to have a full screen display, then you'll want to use desktop mode. That'll essentially turn your screen into a mouse cursor, and now you can navigate through your apps and then launch them on your external display. And so this is how you can play 16:9 content on your device. You basically have to go into desktop mode and then launch it from there. And the nice thing about this is if you use a front end like Emulation Station, which is dynamic between 4:3 and 16:9, it'll actually show up as 16:9 when you're in desktop mode. Not only that, when playing 4:3 content, it's still going to show up in 4:3. And so I think overall, desktop mode is probably the way to go. It's going to be a lot more apparent when playing 16:9 content, like going back to that PSP game. This is going to look a lot better. And when it comes to 4:3 content, it'll be pretty seamless as well. Now, one thing I did notice when testing out this external display is that I found a little bit of a lag every once in a while. About every 20 seconds, I would get about a half second of lag, and it was just really weird. Now, initially I thought it was maybe some sort of performance thing, but no, I went back and tested the same game and it played absolutely smooth when in handheld mode. And it also didn't depend on whether or not it was a hard or easy to run game. Every single game had this slowdown. And so I'm going to play a little bit on this Sega Genesis game, and I'm hoping you can see a little bit of the lag. What'll happen is the lag will happen on screen, and then a couple seconds later, you will see the frames per second dip in RetroArch. And this is the first time I've seen this problem in one of these devices from Anbernic, so this is kind of weird. Now, I did report this issue to the software team over at Anbernic, so hopefully they will be able to find it and fix it. And if they do happen to fix it, I'll leave a pinned comment in this video to let you know that it's now been updated. I've never actually seen this on a handheld before, so I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I'm hoping that they can find it. Okay, now let's go over the software experience. This is going to be running Android 13. Now, much like with other Anbernic devices, it will come preloaded with a bunch of different apps. And some of these are going to be pre-configured to give you the best performance for this chipset. However, also bear in mind that some of these are pretty shady. In fact, many of these are paid apps that they've cracked and then put on the device. Now, thankfully, it will come with Google Play Store. And so what I generally will do is I'll delete all of these emulator apps and then load them up myself. And so that'll all be up to you, but I do have a written guide on my website that'll walk you through how to set up a device with this chipset. And also bear in mind, this will not come preloaded with any games. You'll have to add them yourself, or they will try to upsell you with a card on their website. And so here's a look at the Anbernic launcher, which will work pretty seamlessly with the cards if you buy them from the website, but you can also use it with your own ROMs as well. And so this is a simple way to navigate through and load up your games if you want to use that. Personally, I like to use third-party launchers like Emulation Station, and I've got videos about that on this channel. Now, if you want to make any sort of adjustments to the device, you've got a couple different options. The first is going to be to swipe down from the top menu. Here in the top notifications menu bar, you can do things like adjust the analog stick color and brightness, and you can also change the button input layout from Nintendo Switch style to Xbox style and vice versa. Now, one thing that's new that I noticed in this device is that if you go into the Android settings, they now have a section called Handheld Game Console Settings. And within here are new menu options that are available for this Anbernic device. It's a very similar setup to other Android-based handhelds like the Retroid and the Odin. And I did find this to be a little bit easier than trying to hunt down each individual setting within the top-down notifications menu. To give you an idea of my own setup, I decided to just use a single color with my transparent purple model. I decided to give these analog sticks an orange color. Kind of reminded me a little bit of Spyro the Dragon. The color itself comes out a little bit on the yellow side, but I still think it looks pretty cool as a nice contrast. Now, also within here, you can calibrate your joysticks in case there's any sort of issue, and you can also adjust the sensitivity as well as the dead zone range. So you have quite a few options here within this menu. Now, these devices arrived the other day, and so I've already spent about a day setting up the purple model, and I have everything the way I want it. So as you can see here, I've deleted all the Anbernic emulators and apps, and I've added my own. And then of course I went through and configured all of them, and then I'm using the Emulation Station Desktop Edition front end. Like I mentioned, I've already made a video guide about this. I'll leave it linked down below, but this allows me to basically wrap everything together in a nice and easy to use package. The theme I'm using right here is called Iconic, and it's one of my favorites on this platform. And so once you have this all set up, this is what it's going to be like. You can navigate through your systems, then pick your games, and then launch them. And then of course, once you finish a game, it'll take you right back to Emulation Station. Now, before we jump into actual emulation performance testing, let's talk about the screen. And I think overall it's a pretty good display. It is LCD, not OLED, but I think the colors are still pretty nice. In addition, we have a wide range of both brightness and darkness, so it gets pretty bright at the brightest setting and gets very dark at the darkest. And I found in general somewhere between 50% and 75% is the optimal brightness for me when playing indoors. Now when playing it in direct sunlight, it's going to be a little bit hit or miss. If you're playing something that is somewhat bright on the screen, for example the front menu in Mega Man 2, then yes, at maximum brightness you can play this in direct sunlight. However, if you're playing something in a darker environment, it's probably not going to work out. When it comes down to it, in terms of quality, I would say this is a good screen, but not an exceptional one. The colors are about as rich and vibrant as you would expect with an LCD panel, and it does get quite bright and quite dim, and so I think it's pretty standard when it comes to one of these handhelds. The big difference is going to be that upscaled resolution of 960 by 720, which we will do testing with in our emulation performance part. Another thing worth noting is that we have fairly thick bezels on this device. They're not huge, but they're definitely prominent. Especially when looking at the all-white device, it's a pretty stark contrast. Now when comparing it with the Retroid Pocket Mini, which has a quote-unquote bezel-less design, you can still see that the RG406H screen is quite impressive. Yes, it does have visible bezels compared to the other one, but I think that this screen-to-body ratio is a little bit better anyway. And so in the end, I don't really mind the black bezel around the device, but it is less apparent on the transparent model, and I assume also on the black model too. And the nice thing about having a black bezel like this is that when you use a geometric shader, something that is a little bit more rounded on the edges to mimic an old TV, the black bezel just enhances that overall look and feel even more. And so I think playing around with some of these CRT shaders is going to look really good having that black bezel around the screen. Okay, so now let's move into game testing. We'll start with a little bit of Android gaming. Now personally, this isn't going to be the primary thing that I do on this handheld, but I did want to note that yes, most of these games are going to play fine. Also, many of these games have native 4x3 support. Now, how well each of these games run are really going to be up to the game itself. For example, with Dead Cells, I found that even though this is a 4-inch screen, the character is a little bit on the small side. And so I probably wouldn't want to play this game on this device just because it is a little bit squinty. Now, something like Minecraft I think would be a really good fit because this is obviously just a bigger and chunkier game. I'm playing this with the standard settings and I got a hiccup every once in a while, but for the most part I would say this is very playable. I also think that Stardew Valley would be a really good fit. This one also has native 4x3 support and it's just a nice relaxing game to use on the screen. But of course, I don't think that many people are going to be buying this just for Android gaming, so let's talk about emulation. We're going to start with the low-end systems and work our way up, and I want to talk through this whole experience. Let's start with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, because these are actually a perfect 5x integer scale when played on the screen. You will get black bars on the left and right because it is a 10:9 aspect ratio system, but the pixels will be perfectly scaled. And so really all you have to do at this point is just add some colorization for the original Game Boy, and then maybe add an LCD shader and you are good to go. And so I do think this is one of the better ways to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color because of that integer scale. Now obviously a handheld that costs somewhere around $175 is a little bit overkill to play these older systems, but it is still a very nice experience. Another system that is integer scaled is Game Boy Advance. This one is going to be a 4x integer scale and it looks amazing. And so here you don't really have to do anything other than using an LCD shader. Everything else will take care of itself. Now the Game Boy was a 3:2 aspect ratio system, which is a little bit wider than 4:3, so you will have some black bars at the top and bottom. But overall, I think it's still relatively minimal, and then also it's great that we're getting integer scaling as well. Again, you're probably not going to buy an Anbernic RG406H to play Game Boy Advance, but it is nice to see that it runs wonderfully here. Now when it comes to the retro home console systems, NES and Super Nintendo, these all look really good too. They're not going to be at a perfect integer scale, but they are very close. And so I think just out of the box, it's going to be a very nice looking experience like you can see here with NES. However, it's also easy to get an elevated experience with these handhelds. Let's use Mega Man X as our example. So here I'm using a combination of two different shaders to get a very balanced image. You can see with Mega Man's life bar on the left, it is perfectly balanced. So what I'm using here is the Pixel AA shader to balance out the pixels, and then I'm throwing on another shader on top of it called CRT Easy Mode. This is a relatively light shader, so it doesn't give you a pronounced effect, but I still think it enhances the image overall. And because the T820 chipset in this handheld is pretty powerful, we can throw on multiple shaders and it's still going to work at full speed. And so this is the way I've been playing my retro systems like Super Nintendo and Genesis and NES. This allows me to balance the pixels the way I want while still having a crisp image that I then add a CRT effect to. And because it's a native 4:3 aspect ratio display, it's going to fill up the whole thing, and I think it looks wonderful. So again, even though this is way more power than we need to be able to play things up through Super Nintendo, it's pretty awesome to be able to have this on a 4-inch display with a higher resolution. All these games are going to run somewhere between a 3x and a 3.2x scale depending on the game itself. And honestly, yeah, I think it's one of the better ways to play some of these retro 4:3 systems. It's also a similar experience when playing arcade games. Many of these had varying different resolutions, so it's hard to find one that fits it all. But again, I did find that one of my favorite ways to play some of these games was to add a CRT shader. Nothing really heavy that's going to make it like a super big TV effect, but really just kind of adding a little bit of texture. And so I found myself alternating between the CRT aperture shader and then a CRT easy mode shader. And so again, this is probably one of my favorite ways to play arcade games, especially because we have an analog-centric device and I like to play my arcade games with an analog stick. Moving on to 3D-based home console systems, we'll start with PS1. Now we've got enough power to be able to upscale this to like a 3x resolution, which will give us a 720p image. But personally, I was really enjoying the overall retro look and feel of using a CRT shader again. And that's going to be the nice thing about having a device with this much power. You can choose between the upscaled resolution to make it look like a remastered game, or you can add a shader to make it look like how it did back in the day. Now when it came to Nintendo 64, I had the same choice to make, but this time around I decided to use upscaling instead. So here I am running these games at a 3x resolution or a 720p upscale, and yeah, I think it looks good. And from a performance standpoint, this will be able to play any of these Nintendo 64 games at that 720p upscale. Now for Sega Dreamcast, I decided to use the Redream emulator. Now this one doesn't have a 720p upscale, it only goes in whole integer scales, and so I had to go up to a 960p. And so this is going to be more pixels than the screen can handle, but again, from a performance standpoint, it's not really an issue. All these games are going to play at full speed, no problem. Now moving on to a system that's harder to emulate is going to be Sega Saturn. Now this one cannot use the Beetle Saturn core, which is my preferred core. It's a lot more accurate. Unfortunately, that one's a little bit too demanding for this chipset, so instead I like to use the Yabusan Shiro core. You could also use the standalone Yabusan Shiro app. They both will give you a very similar level of performance. But I found that the Yabusan Shiro core within RetroArch is just an easier fit for me because I have all those hotkeys set up and everything. And honestly, just about every single game that I tried to play worked out pretty well. And I remember about a year ago when I first tried out this chipset, it actually had a lot of issues playing some of these games accurately. So it does look like we've seen some improvements, either from the drivers or the emulators themselves, because some of these games are playing really well. Either way, I think that you can play most Sega Saturn games on this device. You'll just have to make some compromises, like using the Yabusan Shiro core instead of the Beetle one. Okay, next we're going to try out PSP emulation. Now this one is actually a perfect integer scale of a 2x resolution. It won't be a perfect fit because this is a 16:9 system, but at least you'll be able to get perfectly paired pixels. And this chipset can perform well above a 2x resolution with this system, and so all these games are going to play just fine. However, because we are dealing with these black bars at the top and bottom, there are some games that you may not want to play on PSP if there is an alternative. Let's take Outrun 2006 as our first example. This is usually my preferred way to play this game because it's nice and widescreen and I think it upscales really nicely. However, if you're trying to get the most bang for your buck when it comes to filling out the screen, then you might want to try out the PS2 version of this game instead. And it runs relatively well with a 1.5x resolution after doing a couple graphics settings tweaks. So this might be the way to go for you if you are trying to fill up the entirety of the screen. Another example would be X-Men Legends 2, another game that I like to play on the PSP just because it is nice and widescreen. This game's a little bit harder to run on the Gen 6 systems, but I did find that the GameCube version played relatively well, but only at a native resolution. However, I did find that the lighting in this game was a lot better on GameCube than it was in PSP. Everything's just a little bit brighter. And so again, it is nice to have these options between the home console and portable versions, and the 4:3 display tends to lend itself better to something like PS2 or GameCube. We'll talk about those systems in a moment, but first let's talk about 3DS. Now the big issue with this system has nothing to do with the performance. Actually, most games can play at a 2 or a 3x resolution no problem. It all really comes down to the chore of trying to play a dual screen system on a single screen. You've got a couple hotkeys you can set up so that you can toggle between different screen layouts, but I've always found that the best setup when it comes to a 4:3 display is to just show one screen at a time. And due to the nature of this setup, the games that you probably are going to want to play the most are those that you can see just one screen at a time and not have to worry about the other. So effectively, this may limit the type of games that you want to play, but if you are trying to play certain 3DS games, they should run on here. This is also a touchscreen, so if you want to use any of those touch inputs with those games, it'll work as well. And I've also found that the games that work the best are those that have the primary screen on the bottom. For example, here with Zookeeper 3D, this bottom screen actually is 4x3, so it fills up the entire thing. So again, you just really have to be choosy about which games to play on 3DS, and some of these might be a really good fit. Okay, now let's move into GameCube, and this one is actually a really great system to play on this handheld. Most of these games will run at a 2x resolution, and there is nothing like playing a GameCube game on a native 4x3 display. Now of course, if you had a widescreen device like the Retroid Pocket 5, you could always use widescreen hacks, but personally I like the original feeling of playing these in 4x3. It's also nice not to have to dig into the settings to figure out whether or not a game is going to have any sort of glitching on the left and right when you try to use a widescreen hack. And so personally, I find this to be one of my favorite ways to play GameCube, just because the screen is nice and big, and most of these games will run at a 2x resolution, which is more than enough pixels for the screen. But as a word of caution, not every single GameCube game is going to play at full speed at a 2x resolution. There will be some games like Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 that'll have to be dropped down to a native resolution. I still think it looks very good. After all, this is what the games looked like back in the day, and so we're not losing any quality here, we're just not upscaling. But also bear in mind there is a performance ceiling, and so some games like Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes won't play at full speed even at a native resolution. But I would say the vast majority of GameCube games will be playable at some state with this device. Now moving into Nintendo Wii, it's going to be a pretty similar experience, but this system is a little bit more demanding. Number one, make sure that you go into the Dolphin settings and switch the Wii settings over to 4x3. And I would say that most of the Wii games do have 4x3 support, so you'll be able to fill up the whole screen, and I think they look great. But I would say more often than not, you will probably need to play these games at a 1x or native resolution as opposed to a 2x upscale. Again, I don't think it's a bad thing because I think these games look really good, but it is just a matter of making sure that you drop it down if you have performance issues. And much like with GameCube, there will be some games that don't run at full speed, but the majority will. Now, one thing worth noting, once you get into GameCube and PS2, it is worth changing the performance mode in the top-down menu to what they call high mode. In previous versions of the software, I never really saw any performance benefit from turning this on, but I did find it with this device. Let me show you an easy example here with PS2. When going through this corridor in particular in Dragon Quest VIII, you can see that even at a native resolution, you'll get a lot of slowdown. However, when turning on the high mode, I can go through that corridor and it's going to stay at full speed. And so there is definitely something going on when you turn on this CPU performance mode. It does enhance the gameplay. It's a very slight change, but in some games it'll be the difference between playing at full speed or having some slowdown. So let's talk about PS2, and I found that many games will play at a 1.5x resolution, and that's going to give us enough pixels to be able to upscale to the screen's resolution. However, I would say more often than not, games wouldn't play at full speed at 1.5x resolution, but they would play fine natively. So my recommendation would be to turn it on to a 1x or native resolution and then play it like that. And then if the game is playing really well, then you can upscale it to 1.5x and see what happens. But either way, I would say this is probably going to be your best standard with PS2 in this chipset, is to try it at a native 1x resolution. And also bear in mind that performance is going to be more demanding with PS2 compared to GameCube and even Wii. And it really is going to come down to how much slowdown you can tolerate when playing these games. For example, with Ratchet & Clank, this is a game that will dip down here and there, even at a native resolution. Now personally, I don't find this to be game breaking, so I would be comfortable playing through this game just knowing that I would get slowdown from time to time. It almost feels like playing on an actual PS2, which also used to get some slowdown in some of these games. And it's going to be a similar experience with most other 3D platformers, like Jak and Daxter and Sly Cooper. You're going to get some slowdown here and there, and whether or not you can tolerate it is going to be up to you. But bear in mind that there were quite a few more games that I found that didn't play at full speed compared to something like GameCube and Wii. For example, Beautiful Joe has a little bit more slowdown than I can tolerate, and so I probably would just play the GameCube version of this game as opposed to the PS2 one. Other games like The Getaway had some graphical glitches. No matter what I changed in the settings, I still had this fog in front of my car and I couldn't get rid of it. Other games like Area 51 I considered to be unplayable. Not only were the graphics all sorts of messed up, but it only played at about 50% speed. And being that this is the fourth device I've tested with this chipset, the performance here is about in line with what I was expecting. Most PS2, GameCube, and Wii games will play pretty well. I'm comfortable saying that this is a PS2 friendly handheld. But just bear in mind that there are quite a few games that won't play at full speed, and you'll have to do other things to get around it. You can try using a mild underclock, or maybe using a PAL version of the game which will only run at 50 frames per second. Those are the kind of workarounds and hacks that you'll have to mess around with just to see if you can get a little bit more performance out of the handheld. Ideally, we would have enough power that can just kind of brute force our way through it, but unfortunately the TA20 is just not there. So long story short, most games will play well, but there are going to be exceptions, and unfortunately some of those exceptions might be the games you are trying to play the most. Okay, moving on, I did try a little bit of Wii U emulation, and I found that the latest build of the CMU app actually played on this chipset. And when it came to very lightweight games, like 2D platformers like Guacamelee, yeah, this actually was playing at full speed. I would totally play this game on this device. However, as soon as you start to play a game that's a little bit more demanding, for example DuckTales Remastered, which is still a 2D platformer, this one was playing nowhere close to full speed. So there might be a few Wii U games that you can play, but the vast majority are probably going to be too much for this chipset. It's also going to be a similar story with Yuzu. Quite a few 2D and lightweight games will play pretty well. Personally, I don't really like playing 16:9 games on a 4:3 handheld like this, but at least because it's a 4-inch display, we are getting a relatively large image. So there might be a couple lightweight or indie games that you really want to play on this handheld, and using a Switch emulator might make that possible. But just bear in mind that again, once you start getting into the harder to play games, even something like Blasphemous 2, it's just not going to run at full speed. So if anything, I would consider Wii U and Nintendo Switch to be these bonus systems that you can try out, but definitely don't buy this device to try to play any of these games. Okay, that's it for my testing. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the RG406H. And there are quite a few things that I like about it, and I think number one here is that it's a very comfortable handheld. Much like with the RG Cube, they did a good job here when it came to the ergonomic grips and just the overall look and feel of it. I'm also a big fan of this screen, especially when it comes to retro gaming. I think it's an ideal setup between the 4-inch diagonal size, but then also that 720p resolution. It gives us a lot of options when it comes to retro game scaling, while also having enough power to be able to use shaders as well. I also really like that they use these new sticks because I think they are great. They've got a full range of motion and are nice and smooth, and so I hope to see them in future Anbernic devices. And even though this device definitely has a performance cap, I think it has a pretty good price to performance ratio. For about $175, we can play most PS2, GameCube, and Wii games, and I think they look great on this handheld. It's not going to have better performance than the devices that are more expensive than it, but I think it's a good middle ground. And then finally, it feels like the RG406H is a handheld that has everything just coming together all at once. We finally have an updated screen and updated sticks on a form factor that already works really well. And so even though it is a little bit exhausting to deal with iteration after iteration of Anbernic devices, it is kind of cool to see what they're finally reaching. However, there is still room for improvements. Let's talk about some of the things that I don't like about the RG406H. Number one is the fact that it's a little bit bulky. Now, this is just a concession that happens with the fact that we have these sticks that protrude quite a bit. When you combine that with those ergonomic grips, it is a pretty thick handheld. Now, personally, I don't plan on putting this device in my pocket that often, but if you do, then this might be a deal breaker. Another thing that caught me off guard is the little bit of slowdown that you get when playing with video out. And this does appear to be an issue when it comes to software, and like I mentioned, I've reported it to the team, so hopefully they can come up with an update. But as it stands right now, every 20 seconds or so you'll get about a second of slowdown. It can get pretty annoying. And so if one of the reasons why you're thinking about getting this handheld is because you can play it on an external display, you might want to wait and see if they come up with an update first. Hey, this is Late Night Editing Russ. So I just got a message from Anbernic. They say they've identified the problem as well as a fix for it, and they should have it pushed in the next couple days, and it'll be fixed well before they ship any retail units. I'm still going to leave this part in the video just to show that there was this software bug, and once we have an actual fix and I can verify it, then I'll leave that pinned comment. And then finally, this is no fault of Anbernic's, but there's some really stiff competition out there. And so even though it is easy to recommend the RG406H at this price point, it is also worth considering the other options that you have on the market. The first one you might consider is the Retroid Pocket Mini. This one's about $30 more expensive when you factor in shipping, but it does come with an AMOLED display, which quality-wise is much better. However, the Retroid Pocket Mini also has a smaller display. It's 3.7 inches, and I also don't like these face buttons very much. And so even though the Retroid Pocket Mini is quite a bit more powerful, I think I would rather play 4x3 games on the RG406H. I really like having that larger display, and it also scales really nicely. Now, if you're willing to spend about $50 more than the RG406H, it is definitely worth considering the Retroid Pocket 5. This one just came out and I recently made a review about it, and I think this one is the best mid-tier handheld right now. It's a little bit of a different experience because it is a 16:9 display, but overall I think this is just more bang for your buck. And so even though the RG406H is an excellent handheld, it is hard to say that it's the one to get when for about $50 more you can get something that's quite a bit better. I think when it comes down to it, the RG406H is a really good handheld in its own right. If you're willing to pay more, yes, you can get a better experience, but at this price point, if I had to pick one handheld to get at $175, this would be the one. Like with many other Anbernic devices, in the slice of time of its release, it's the best one they've ever made. And given how many things they got right with this handheld, I'm not sure how much better the next ones will be. And so going back to that original question that we had in the beginning of this video, whether or not it's worth getting this one or waiting one or two next releases to see whether or not those ones are going to be better, I have a hard time envisioning something that can get better than this. I think that Anbernic really nailed just about everything that I can think of. We've got a nice big display and great controls and good ergonomics and performance that'll play most of the systems I want to play. And when it comes to retro game emulation, that's about all I could ever ask for. So in wrapping up, if you're asking whether or not I recommend this handheld, it's really going to come down to you. If you are looking for something with a 4:3 aspect ratio with a larger screen and a larger resolution, then yes, I think that the RG406H is a safe bet. I'm sure that Anbernic has more handhelds coming in the future, one about every month. But I think that if I picked up this handheld and then turned off the internet or maybe went to a deserted island, I would be happy for years to come. This thing can play thousands upon thousands of my favorite retro games in really excellent conditions. So in a nutshell, yeah, I think that Anbernic made a really good handheld here, and even though I think they'll probably make something better down the line, I'm not really sure how they can pull that off. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you going to pick up this one, or are you going to wait for the next imminent release? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.